Alright, we're back. It's been, nearly 2 days since I've talked any substantive basketball, and, 3 days since I've been on air. Going to be on air mostly for 2 games on the given day of slate going forward. Not necessarily that exclusively, but more of the one-day onlys. I won't be there, I assure you, in the event that the $1 million contests on the finals. I will certainly be present for, again, DraftKings has a $2.5 million prize pool, $1 million to first on the first day of the finals. I'm curious, honestly, to see whether they do multi-day, which would be a much better game, or the most ridiculous showdown game ever, but that's going to occur, and I'll certainly be there for that day, and potentially some others. So we were talking in Slack, talk about a couple of things as people file into the room. So someone just said in Slack a moment ago that the difference between Mirotic last game on FanDuel and this game where his price has spiked to 4,400 is that he can't be your drop. Now, I completely disagree with that construct for the following reason, but it's a conversation I'm happy to have. There are many value plays on this slate, obviously, from, we'll say, $4,400 and under on FanDuel. I'll do a brief listing of the ones that I would have any degree of interest in, and then talk this through for a second. So, we have me not being logged into anything, so this will take a second longer than I expected, but it's a good game theory conversation, so I'd like to have it. So guys who cost his number and under that I think are, at the moment at least, perfectly viable plays. So we'll start with Mirotic and Malik Beasley at 4,400. That's 2. Rozier at 4,300. That's 3. Mason Plumlee, Pat Connaughton, Ersan, Barton, Hill, Craig, Collins, Hood. I think Evan Turner, in theory, I don't think I'd go there, but we'll add him to the list. Monty Morris. And I suppose Seth Curry would still be a reasonable play in a tournament for me. So that was 10 or 11 guys. It's saying you can't drop Miro would only be correct if you presume multiple of those guys will outscore him, 2 or probably 3, and if your lineup, it's also sets aside the issue of positionality that we're dealing with there. If we limit the sample to small forward, which is obviously an incredibly thin position, which is one of the reasons that Mirotic is more appealing. Small forward is Giannis, Hayward, Harkless in theory, but Giannis, Hayward, Mirotic, Barton, Hood. There are 5 guys at small forward. So not only would you need some of the other value to exceed what he does on this slate, you would also need some of the other small forwards to be good. Now, I don't think he's a must-play whatsoever. I am fine playing Rodney Hood instead. I am fine playing Will Barton instead. I am fine paying up and playing Hayward and Giannis. He's by no means a must-play smash on FanDuel, and he'll be incredibly popular, which is another great reason to fade him. Feel free to fade him. But I think saying, due to this slate construction, that he isn't viable value or he's not okay to drop on this slate is just wrong. For him to be a bad drop, you need lots of other value to do well. At least one of the ones at his position. So anyhow, I can certainly see the best possible lineup tonight having 2 value small forwards, of which Miro is the one who gets dropped. Like Rodney Hood gets there, Miro doesn't, you drop him. As an abstraction, generally on smaller slates, the rules of DFS we try to follow all loosen up. You worry less about having the best correlation. You were, other than trying to stack games. That's the one thing that sort of does get a little bit stronger. And yeah, on a 10-game slate, you're going to feel bad about your odds of winning a GPP if you drop a guy who costs $900 over the floor, as opposed to a guy who costs $0 over the floor. I think that's conceptually a good idea if you're building on a giant slate. being like, oh, I have this guy, I can just drop him if he doesn't do well, and the guy costs $4,400, that is probably an appropriate level of concern. On a 2-game slate, I don't agree with that line of thinking whatsoever. You absolutely can drop that guy, and the best possible line, forgetting everything else I just said, all you need is for one other small forward to be good only, and that's incredibly popular. If Gordon Hayward gets 25, and Giannis gets 50, and Barton gets 18, and Hood gets 14, all of which are perfectly possible outcomes, then dropping your 4,400 Mirotic is just fine. And this, of course, setting aside the fact that by any objective standard, he's the best points per dollar play at small forward. So, but yeah, the idea that, dropping him would be bad, I just simply don't agree with, especially in the case where a couple of the lineups I've tinkered around with today, there's only him and one other piece of value. So if you play him next to, let's say it's Rodney Hood, and Rodney Hood gets 28 and he gets 20, and you drop Mirotic, you could still end up with the best possible lineup, or him and Barton, or so there's just any number of ways dropping him would be fine. And again, the percentage of outcomes that come out that way is much higher on a 2-game slate than a smaller slate. But a very good point, and I appreciate the discussion point. Still a couple people. Yeah, so the 76ers. So I took, I believe, a deserved amount of guff, we shall call it, using that granddad language, for me predicting the Raptors to win their series with the 76ers in 5 games. The first round went, with the exception of Portland and Oklahoma City, I think all my predictions were, of the other 7, 3 were exactly right, 3 were off by a game, and 3 were off by 2 games, but I got the winners right. And in fairness, almost everyone got the winners right. Those were not tough to call. But the reason I bring this up is what I had in common with the first round miss of Oklahoma City and Portland, and the second round certainly miss as far as getting it exactly right, but quite possibly Philadelphia has put themselves in a good position to win this series. Was the center matchups just didn't go at all how I thought. Cantor is a noticeably bad defender, to the extent that his coaches have openly said, just can't have him on the floor, and other teams are calling him out and designing offenses to just beat him up. And I thought with a couple talented playmakers in Russ and Paul George, and I'm a big Steven Adams fan, that liability would be enough that combined with the fact that I could be wrong here, but I think Oklahoma City beat Portland all 4 games in the regular season. I thought Oklahoma City won that series. That's not what happened at all. Cantor's defense was good enough. Did fine. Steven Adams has obviously been for the last few months and continues to be a little bit beat up. He plays very physical, but he's obviously not 100%, so they didn't really take much advantage of that matchup, and that's how they went down. Going into the series with the Sixers, I went back and forth between saying Toronto in 6 and Toronto in 5, and I eventually sided down to Toronto in 5 because I was just really worried about Joel Embiid. And I think, hopefully everyone could agree, without Joel Embiid, this becomes really, really difficult. So if Joel Embiid is missing or very limited or not doing extremely well, it's going to be hard, we'll put it that way, for Philadelphia to pull a lot of games against this Raptors team. And just it simply hasn't played out that way. Lowry has been incredibly unimpressive. I expected the Raptors bench, which has been widely lauded, obviously got worse with some of the pieces they traded for Marc Gasol, to be much more functional than the 76ers bench, which has been hammered all year. And they, again, made a decent bit worse, trading for Tobias, trading for Jimmy, and all that. But the Sixers bench has been better. And the Toronto bench has been terrible. Lowry has looked bad. Giannis has looked wonderful. Embiid has looked wonderful. He looked just great last night. And again, I had some concern that he'd be healthy. Looks healthy. Concerned about the minutes. And Marc Gasol is one of the 2 or 3 worst matchups in the NBA for him. So, and both those things that I got apparently incredibly wrong, they had that similar. I mean, there was also, the record, the benches, etc. But that hasn't gone extremely well. So yes, to those of you who said, "Boy, you got that wrong," yes, I did thus far. I'm still hopeful for the series. I would really have to sit down here and look at it for a while. I have some real issues with Nick Nurse's rotations. some of the things he's doing. Part of me really wants to say you should just shadow Embiid with Gasol. He was better against him last game, but still worse than he was against anyone else who was defending him. And that's why he's there, and he's not doing anything else. I think one of the hopes when you get Marc Gasol is that he's going to go out there and be a functional member of the offense and spread the floor and knock down some threes and pull Embiid away from the basket and do lots of things, including make Embiid's life difficult. And he really hasn't done much but make Embiid's life difficult, which, my takeaway would be like, okay, well then just make sure he does that well, because I still think you probably win at that point. So I'm surprised, looking at any basic interpretation of the stats, the rotations, the effectiveness of Embiid with him on and him off, that they just don't literally have Marc Gasol sit close to the scorer's table and every time he sees Embiid get up, have him get up. I don't have any good reason to think that isn't the best way to win this series. Anyhow, that should be enough time for people to file in and talk about some other things. So 2 games this evening, 2 series that are split 1 game apiece. Both returning to the teams that have came in as lower seeds but have stolen home court advantage, so to speak. We have the Bucks first at 8 Eastern, visiting the Celtics, followed up obviously with Denver and Portland 2.5 hours later, so that you can watch every minute of these glorious basketball games. So let's start by talking about Giannis, and I guess by extension Jokic. They're the 2 spend-up options here. Their prices on DK are the same, within $100, and on FanDuel are $300 extra for Jokic. Looking at what we early guess the ownership to be, we have a little bit more Giannis than Jokic, I believe, on both sites. Let me confirm that real quick, but that was my impression. A good bit more on FanDuel, where there is a positionality issue. Basically, it's as simple as on FanDuel, if you play Jokic, you can't play Horford. And on DK, you can still play Horford, and people are in love with Horford, and congratulations, you're late to the party, but yeah, you should be. He's still a little bit too cheap, and one of the only guys who's priced very fairly on FanDuel, frankly. I probably slightly prefer playing Nikola Jokic at this point. Even if the ownership was even, the salary is obviously difficult. They are 2 transcendent players. It's important to understand that as good as Jokic is, by any reasonable way of looking at fantasy production, Giannis is better. And the concern would come with the fact that at any point they can unleash 40-something minutes of Giannis in a close game. Frankly, I've been disappointed at how much they've rolled him out there, kind of through the playoffs, although obviously Detroit was pretty much a bird in the hand. But last year, again, admittedly different coach before Coach Bud arrived on the scene, well, we saw multiple 40-plus Giannis games in regulation, and a little bit of my concern there is that part of the reason I lean Jokic is I have him projected for 3 more minutes, but especially as this series goes on, much like I would make the other changes I discussed regarding Gasol and Embiid, I would have Giannis on the court more. He does not appear to be struggling with fatigue. Again, they asked Nick Nurse about Kawhi, and we'll talk about this. I don't know, do they play tomorrow or Sunday? Because I imagine I will be off tomorrow, but next time I talk about them, we'll talk about the historically different on-off numbers for Kawhi Leonard in these playoffs. Like, they are amazing when he's on the court and dog shit when he's not. You're talking about 50-point differences in efficiency. It's really something to behold. And they asked Nick Nurse, could he play 48 minutes? And Nick Nurse was like, well, I don't think so, but he doesn't technically have a minutes cap, so that'll be interesting to look at as we get there. But there is, in case of emergency, break 10 minutes of extra Giannis glass-covered button somewhere in the Bucks clubhouse that I have some concern with. But again, I would slightly rather play Nikola Jokic on both sides. I do think it's most likely he plays a few extra minutes, and that combined with the fact that even though Giannis is a better fantasy basketball player, to reduce it to that approximation by a little, and Jokic is making it more of a contest in the postseason, Jokic has a above average matchup, and Giannis does not. And I can pretty clearly see the way against the Celtics, which we've seen before, that Giannis is a little bit limited enough. Obviously, it starts with Horford as a brilliant defender. By the way, someone wrote me today that I think that Marcus Morris's minutes were guaranteed because he was, I think he read somewhere that he was Giannis's primary defender. He's not his primary defender. He's not his secondary defender. He's not his tertiary defender. I think Giannis has seen the fourth most possessions out of Marcus Morris of guys on this team defending him, so I don't know. Careful what you read. But I believe they have a similar ceiling. I would say Giannis is higher. I think there's very little chance I get more than 80 out of Jokic tonight. Giannis can give you a 100-point game. It's pretty goddamn unlikely against Celtics, but raw projection, I have Jokic a point higher. And he's going to be, I think, a little bit less owned. So DK, where there basically are no positions, that's where I would lean with a single lineup. If I'm building 100 lineups, it's like 60 and 40 for me, with obviously some overlap. So it might be 65 and 45 because of I would have very few lineups with neither, though I don't think that's an unreasonable build. Obviously, you're going to want to make sure at that point that you have, I would think, some Jamal Murray and some Paul Millsap, and a lot of Eric Bledsoe and Chris Middleton in those lineups. But you obviously can build in either. I don't think that's crazy. But I'd slightly lean towards Jokic for those reasons. The last game wasn't great. And again, the last game he shot poorly, didn't get his triple-double, had only one stock. The minutes were limited a little bit, and shot whatever horrible number from the field and ended up with 45 fantasy points. Like, that's like a bottom 10% game outcome out of him. So I slightly lean that way, but not distinctively so. Second guy I suppose we should talk about on the Bucks would be Nikola Mirotic. I'm obviously a fan. I think he is fine to fade because of immense popularity, especially on FanDuel, where again the position is very limiting, but having Hood or Barton or pay-ups at that position are just fine for me. And, can obviously fail a couple ways. The minutes aren't locked in stone. I am for 29 minutes. I think in a close game he plays somewhere up towards 30 minutes. Again, we haven't had a close game yet in this series. His production in that last game was a little bit specious. He played whatever it was, 25 minutes, and had north of 30 fantasy points. He had 4 combined steals and blocks in that game. That's a little more than you're going to get out of him on average. Like, there are ways to get away from it if you want to. If you build a lineup and you like it and it doesn't happen to have Mirotic in it, yeah, that's fine. But points per dollar, he is probably the best play on the slate from any sort of raw sense there. A couple people have asked about Brolo, especially at the $4,700 price tag on DraftKings. I understand the interest. In one lineup, I'm still just not going there. In a lot of lineups, I still think I would have very, very little. The team has played so much better with him off the floor. The best offensive weapon that the Celtics have is the Kyrie pick and roll and the pick and pop, and he just can't handle it. He ends up on Kyrie. That's not good. He ends up on Horford. That's not that great either, depending on where they end up. And if you look at, there are sample sizes where we looked at the first half the other day, where I think the Bucks ended the first half up 5 or something, and Brook Lopez was a minus 18. Like, it's bad. Now, is it unplayable? No, it's a 2-game slate. Of course he's not unplayable. There's obviously a world in which he gets up to 30 minutes, which I have him at 23. There's a world in which he gets up to 30 minutes, takes a dozen three-pointers, makes 7 of them, and at 5% owned gets 38. And Horford isn't that great, and you end up, winning the slate because of having that unique center guy. The upside is there. He can pick up blocks. He can get 10 rebounds. Like, it can happen. But, I would still be under. There are times I like to, pivot to guys in a situation like that. But anyone with any, eye for either basketball or looking at a box score would be like, yeah, this is really not going well for him. So he would really need to get going very, very well for that to necessarily work out. I like Bledsoe and Middleton quite a bit. I still like Middleton more by any sort of raw point sensibility. I said this at the start of the series, looking at these teams playing again multiple times this year, playing in the series last year, looking at the individual defensive matchups. And again, I'm a big Bledsoe fan. I talk about him a lot. But the minutes are a little bit threatened there. Again, everyone's minutes have been a little less than they would be due to basically 2 blowouts to start the series. I think the Celtics are up net 1. They won by 22 and lost by 21, if I'm getting that right. But in one lineup, raw points, even for the $700 more on DK, I do think Middleton is a slightly better play. And certainly on FanDuel by any points per dollar where he's $100 more, I would obviously still continue to believe that. I like Bledsoe quite a bit in tournaments. I like Middleton quite a bit in tournaments. If you don't have Giannis on a 2-game slate, I'm going to have real trouble not having at least one of those guys. I think the single DK lineup that I was just tinkering around with had Jokic, Bledsoe, and Middleton as taking my pieces of this game. Stepping back from a bit, I usually do this to start. Neither game is a particularly more advantageous spot to target. If I was to bet on this, I would probably bet the under on the second game. It was real mucky last time. Basically, Portland went out and tried to run the first game of that with a similar system to how they handled that first series with the Thunder, and that obviously didn't work out. And again, I have Denver winning this series in 6 games, and I'll stick with that projection. But last game, they just mucked stuff up and just banged into Jokic a lot. And themselves got out on the break less, and it just was a lot uglier. They scored south of 190 points in that game. This was a historically bad Denver offensive shooting game. They shot somewhere around 21% from 3 and 35% from the field, I think it was. But it was fugly. So it's not going to be that low, but I do think I would suggest that the total should be like 211, 212, 213. Last I looked, it's a few points higher than that. The other one a little more appropriately priced, the early game, sitting at about 219 or 220. I think that's around where that one would come out for me. So if you're looking to sports bet, that's the closest thing I have to a take on that. Pat Connaughton is obviously still in play. He's bad defensively, and he's worse on both ends of the court than George Hill, and I don't understand why they keep running him out there. There are limited situations he can sometimes create a little better on the dribble. So I would be playing, I would take 5 minutes from Pat Connaughton and give him to George Hill again if I was coaching this team. But that has obviously not been happening. And raw points, I would have to certainly consider Connaughton over Hill. He's only, I think, 300 more on DK. I think he's 100 more on FanDuel, though obviously different positions there. He's fine. I generally would rather play, obviously, Mirotic. I would probably rather go to Beasley. I would probably rather go to Hood. But Pat Connaughton, if he's going to play close to 30 minutes, obviously would still remain in play. Ursan, again, probably rather go some places on FanDuel, but $3,100 on DK still merits a mention. Looking at the Celtics, I have had Tatum behind at their prices, Brown and Morris and Hayward for most of the series. I've had Brown as my number one guy, barely over Hayward each of the first couple games. And that has generally played out correctly. I still have Brown scoring more points than those guys all raw, though it's pretty close. And most notably on DraftKings, the price on Jason Tatum is making it a little interesting. Now, the matchup lends itself a little more to guys playing the 2 than the 3 and the 4 if we go back in the year and see the defense they're running. This is I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but this is a Milwaukee team that during the regular season switched very, very rarely. Less than almost any other team in the NBA where the switching has really become pretty rampant. And they've started to step that up a little bit more in the playoffs. But long story short, it just favors shooting guards. It favors just guys who are further away from the basket a little bit more because that ends up being allocated. And that's even exaggerated a little bit more because you have more guys like Connaughton and less guys like Malcolm Brogdon who, along with Marcus Smart, are both going to take the evening off again, but I wouldn't be surprised to see either or both of them by the end of the series. Brogdon apparently a little closer than Smart last I checked. So I'm fine playing Tatum, but he's more popular than I'd like him to be. I think we have projected somewhere around 40% on DK, and again, I have him projected for a little bit less than Jaylen Brown, who costs a little bit less, and we project to be slightly less owned. So It is understandably a difficult spot. He can be, less this year than, say, the year before, a very competent pull-up shooter, which is the easiest way to get there, but this is not an easy team to drive on, and that is a reasonable source of his outcome. So I just do think this matchup hurts him a little more. $5,400 is appealing for me. I have no issue with playing him, but right now we have him at 41% owned. We have Jaylen Brown at 31%. I have Jaylen Brown at projected a hair higher and at 10% lower ownership. I would rather stick there. I would certainly rather play Gary Harris, who we have sitting at 22% and is an additional $300 off that Jaylen Brown price. Although, frustratingly, one of the only guys single position locked on DK, which I wish they would do more since they already have no positions. It's like, well, what do we do? Let's add some utility spots and some hybrid guard and forward only spots, and then let's make sure everyone is listed as playing multiple positions. Like, wow, you guys really want to make sure there's absolutely no skill required there in selecting your players. So I kind of wish they'd stick with one or the other, and I'm fine with the way the lineup, but you already have a utility spot. Making everyone play, having Ben Simmons at point guard, small forward, it's like, sweet. He basically doesn't have a position. Thoughts on Morris versus Tatum on FanDuel? Points per dollar. I have them both a hair behind Paul Millsap and a hair behind Al Farouq Aminu. So just, if I'm looking at power forwards on FanDuel, I would slightly rather play the two non-Celtics. At their prices, let me take a look at what we have their ownership sitting at right now. We have Tatum at 40% again. We have Marcus Morris at 21%. If those numbers are going to be close to correct, I would take with the guy with Haslef. I do like Tatum a little bit more than Morris. Morris 6 for 8 from the field last game, just a slightly higher game for him. I have Tatum projected, I think about 4 fantasy points higher. So I would end up with generally trying to play Tatum, especially if the $800 I think it is doesn't do anything for you. If you are not playing Nikola Jokic on FanDuel, I do think Horford is the next best play by a pretty significant margin. I mean, it's Jokic, then some sort of gap for me, but not a huge one because Horford is really well priced. Then Horford, then a decent gap, then Cantor, and then a pretty big gap, and then you're playing Brolo or $4,300 Mason Plumlee is where I think you go if you're punting that position. But yeah, it's a great spot for Horford. Got 50 or whatever in game 1, had a down game 2. I'm projected 41 points per game for the series. He's still just at a FanDuel price of 7K. He was one of the few guys who's like, wow, that guy's priced extremely well. So yeah, I've absolutely no issue with going there. Interesting. Let's see, other things to talk about at these teams. Still perfectly fine to run Terry Rozier out there on either side. Decent matchup for him last year. The minutes generally won't be there. I probably would try not to have Kyrie Irving in the same lineup, though it's not impossible, but FanDuel, that would be both your point guards, and it'd be a very unique lineup. So I don't think it's impossible. You can get a game where Kyrie gets 55 and Rozier gets 25 and is perfectly equitable as a punt at that FanDuel price. But generally would try not to have them together. Kyrie on DK, I'm a pretty big fan of. I have him projected for a bit north of 45 in this series. The price is still pretty advantageous for that. I like him coming back home. Last game was obviously a woeful shooting game. 4 for 18 is terrible, and that is not apropos of nothing. It is certainly not what I would consider a good matchup for him. But points per dollar, I would prefer Horford, and then the next guy I'd be really trying to get into lineups would be Kyrie Irving. Yeah, let's talk about the second game for a little bit. If I missed anything, I presume it will be brought up to me forthwith during the question and answer portion of the show. All right, so this series rotating into Portland. Let's talk about the big Nugs first. So a couple injuries in this game. Jamal Murray is banged up, but he is going to play. Torrey Craig has a busted nose, but he is going to play. Mo Harkless is still questionable. We likely will not know until that game goes. I guess we'll start talking about Harkless because there's a lot to talk about there. If they announce Harkless is going to play and start, I'm going to like him a lot in tournaments. It is obviously just tournaments. The minutes could be limited. The production very likely would be, but you're just getting a guy who could play 30-something minutes at 4% owned, and that's always going to be worth the uncertainty generally, especially if you don't mind taking a risk. In the event Harkless does not play, I've had a lot of people be like, I would like Evan Turner. You can do that. The price is obviously ridiculously cheap. He is a functional fantasy player, but my best guess would be that it would do absolutely nothing for Evan Turner. I don't think it would change one thing. I don't think it would change his rotations. I don't think it would give him a minute. And again, when Harkless went down, it did nothing for Turner in the last game. He played more minutes in the first half than he did in the second. But the other side being, there's some chance I'm wrong, and given time to think about it. Because in the middle of a game, all you basically do is yank a guy and replace a guy. So, all right, start the second half. They started Jake Layman, and then Rodney Hood played a bucket of minutes. And that's probably the most likely thing that we see happen here. But given a day to think it over, it's important to note also Denver and Portland, I believe, got a day of rest, whereas the Bucks and the Celtics got 2. There's a chance that Stotts sits down and goes like, all right, we're going to try something different. We want, to keep up the defensive pressure, and Jake Layman is a defensive potato, so we'll throw Evan Turner out in there. So there's some chance if Evan Turner starts, I'll be a big fan. That would portend him getting enough minutes that at his price, he would look great. But as things stand now, I would much rather play Rodney Hood. Now, Rodney Hood is not a terribly good basketball player, but he can shoot, and in his role on this team in this series, gets a lot of advantageous matchups, most specifically where he gets Barton, where he gets Beasley, which are just guys he's 4 or 5 inches taller than and shoots over a lot. So where I'm not surprised at all to see Rodney Hood play only 18 minutes today, or play 27 minutes and score 19 fantasy points. He is wicked cheap, and there is an obvious way, and really if I'm going to use wicked as an adjective, it should have been alluding to the game in Boston, just to stay thematic. But Rodney Hood is very cheap. I don't know what Northwest U.S. slang is for, or the equivalent of wicked. But he's still very cheap. I like him quite a bit. Very reasonable if you're paying up on FanDuel to get away from, like if I'm getting away from Chalky Miro, you can play Barton, but I'd much rather play dead-ass minimum price Rodney Hood, who I think the most likely scenario is here continues to see in excess of 25 minutes on the court this evening. I like Paul Millsap a lot. I didn't like him in the last series. I, at the start of the series, had him projected for 26.5 fantasy points a game, and he failed to get to that not very lofty standard. This is a matchup I like for him quite a bit. It bumped him to 33. So I had him projected for 7 more points a game in this series than the last game. There is a ceiling beyond that. He's still not quite expensive enough. I still don't think he's quite owned enough. I'm a pretty big fan of Paul Millsap. I'm fine with going back to Mason Jar Plumlee as a value guy here. Obviously, game 1, we got 20 whatever minutes. Game 2, we only got 12. I do think that is more likely the occurrence. I do think Millsap will play well. I like the spot for him. I do think he gets, 30-plus minutes. I obviously like Jokic quite a bit. I think his minutes continue to trend up in what's obviously a close series. And I don't think Mason Plumlee is going to check in at small forward, so the most likely scenario is you're looking at 12 to 15, I think I have him projected for 14 minutes. You're looking at some, 12 to 15 minute roll again. The 2 reasons I don't mind it is 1, people get in foul trouble, 2, people get injured, and 3, he can get there in 12 minutes. Like, you can get 22 out of him in 12 minutes. It happens, and it's a fine spot for him. So I'm absolutely fine with him still. The ownership, I presume, will have fallen off to a much more tolerable level. And again, you do not have to look that long ago to find him surpassing. I don't know if I could spell Plumlee, it would help here. Yeah, Mason Plumlee, 3%. Okay, well, at 3%, I like Mason Plumlee, but just keep in mind he's going to disappoint you 80% of the time. Other guys with which to discuss. I like Gary Harris a lot. I obviously like him, especially on FanDuel, where $4,900 is functionally a much better price than $4,900 on DraftKings. Dude's going to play 40 minutes. Maybe more, but he's going to play 38. I have him at 39. He's going to play a metric pile of minutes, and while he isn't the greatest fantasy producer, he's, I'm projected a little north of 0.8. Let's round that down to 0.75. 0.75 times 40 is 30. So if you project him for 30 fantasy points and he costs $4,900 on both sites on a 2-game slate, and obviously could exceed that projection, you should have some significant amount of interest in Gary Harris, and not many people do. Relative to the ownership we're seeing here, Torrey Craig, he's a soldier, but he got his nose broke, and that's enough for me to not really want to go there. I don't know what the minutes are going to be, but even that, everyone has trouble shooting with a mask on. I've done it, and he isn't that great of an offensive player anyway. And I just think, for most people, when you start wearing a new knee brace or a new face mask or something like that, you just tend to defer more. You play your hard defense, you make your layups and shit, but you just tend to shoot less. There is data to back this up, by the way, but it's also common sense. You're out there, you feel a little uncomfortable, you're like, all right, still make sure you don't get worked on defense, make the offense run. But normally he projects for all of 8 shots in a full game. That number is probably now closer to 6 or something, and there's just a lot of other exceptional wing value, a la Gary Harris if you count him, and Malik Beasley and Rodney Hood and all the. So for me, Torrey Craig is a bit of a bridge too far. I like Malik Beasley. He's the guy we can most expect to see an effectual continuance of minutes here. I have him at 27 minutes again. At his prices, that sort of speaks for itself. Do I like Sterling Brown at sub 1% ownership? No. I'll still stay away from it. And again, I liked some of the raw stuff I saw out of Sterling Brown. And there were a couple days he did well for us. But he's just, now you put Mirotic in that starting lineup. He's going to be the 4th or 5th option on offense the entire game. I'm not sure he plays. Mirotic, obviously, most stealing time from Brook Lopez and a couple other guys. But I'm not shocked to see Sterling Brown not play today. So now I need him to play, which is probable. Exceed more than 20 minutes, exceed more than a fantasy point a minute. And again, I refer you to previous statement about there is a lot of better wing value. One of the reasons, and probably the largest reason I was on the side of it's okay to drop Mirotic on FanDuel, was the positional restriction, where you have to play 2 small forwards. That makes it interesting. On DK, especially, there's no positions. So trying to run out less than 1% Sterling Brown, you need him to exceed expectations in several ways. It seems like a bridge too far for me. So I don't believe I would play any Sterling Brown today. The concept is not insane, but generally I think I would be disinclined. Jamal Murray, FanDuel price, making it pretty tough. Obviously you can play him in tournament. He is banged up. He's taken a couple shots on hard screens. I don't know what to make of that. When you deal with something like a bruise or a contusion, they can be nothing, and in 2 days you can feel great, or your whole leg can feel like it's swelled up in a pile of shit. I really don't know quite how to judge that, and I haven't been able to get a good read on it from his comments or the coach. But I think he's a little bit down. $6,400 on DK. I think that's just fine. Generally, I'm trying not to play him with Nikola Jokic. So if you don't have Jokic, I like Murray quite a bit. If you don't have Jokic and have Giannis, I'm pretty happy to play Murray before I play Bledsoe and Middleton. So again, just you're thinking somewhat on each team is probably productive. It's sort of the same thing with Lillard and McCollum. And so let's bounce to that team for a minute. Talk about Portland, or the final team really to discuss here. Yeah, at the beginning of the series, I was constantly looking at, all right, we've got this stud and this stud and this stud, and I have to pick one to not play for me. It's going to be Damian Lillard, and that's a pretty similar situation for me here today. Said before Game 1, and Lillard was very good, but they lost. I think Lillard is much easier to get away from than Giannis and Jokic if you're stud stacking. On DK, I prefer saving the money on Kyrie. On FanDuel, it's almost a dead tie for me. On DK, I would rather play Kyrie Irving in a given lineup. But again, are you stacking a game? You're trying to tell a story with your lineup. What exactly are you doing there? And you have a pretty obvious pivot in McCollum. And I said it before Game 1 and didn't turn out. And I said it to the people I talked about for Game 2, but I didn't have a show for Game 2. And it did turn out in that game where I said, look, I think you spend up on Jokic. And you can play Jokic, Lillard, and Scrubs. But I think you play Jokic, McCollum And if Lillard doesn't get there, there's a very good chance McCollum does. He's the most likely guy to pick up some of that slack. It is a very difficult matchup for, I don't know about very difficult matchup, but it is a below average matchup for Damian Lillard. He sees a butt ton of Torrey Craig and Gary Harris. And both those guys are well above average defenders, and they make life a little more difficult. You can certainly say that with Torrey Craig having his face all jacked up, that's a bonus for Lillard. I think that's fine. You can certainly say that the series returning to Portland is a boost for him. I think that's fine to say, and I have no issue with you playing any amount of Damian Lillard. But on FanDuel, I'm a little more excited to play Giannis and Jokic. On DraftKings, I'm a little more excited to play Giannis and Jokic and Kyrie Irving. And one of the reasons is you have McCollum as an obvious pivot point. Now, this is not nearly as good today as it was before Game 2 because McCollum just got there and Lillard just didn't. And by no means misunderstand the fact that Lillard can absolutely get his if he wants. The list of guys who have a decent chance of getting you 60 today is basically Lillard, Irving, Giannis, and Jokic. Other guys, it's on the field, but incredibly unlikely, and a significant percentage of the time. Like when I say, I prefer Kyrie to Lillard, I have Lillard coming in somewhere around 50 fantasy points, and I have Kyrie closer to 45.5, I think. And so just points per dollar, that makes a little more sense for me. I think I re-reduced that, and they're both a couple less now. So I actually have on DK with the 3-point bonus. I don't know why that is not flashing right. Yeah, I have him by about 4.5 over Kyrie, but that still makes Kyrie obviously points per dollar a little more appealing for me. FanDuel, that obviously tightens up quite a bit there. But when I look at one of these guys doing extremely well and just the odds of well exceeding his price, he comes in ranked like that for me a little bit under there. But it's not like in any world that playing Lillard is going to be a bad decision. But the matchups have something to do with that. If you go back and look through the series, Lillard is facing either Craig or Harris in north of 80% of his matchups in this series. McCollum has actually seen more of Harris than anyone else in the series after the Game 2, where Lillard saw a lot more Craig during the portion of the time that Craig was there, obviously. And McCollum got a lot more Harris. I expect that to revert back a little bit today, but McCollum gets more easy matchups because they're making a real focus, obviously, of keeping an elite defender on Lillard. So after Gary Harris, McCollum's next most guys he sees in matchups are Will Barton and Malik Beasley and other guys, and it's just easy for him to get there. And again, you're obviously saving $2,500 and $2,700 on DK. So I like Lillard proportionally much more on FanDuel. Obviously, the price is just, raw differential versus other players better. He is priced more closely to CJ McCollum. McCollum himself is priced less. So that's my long way around of saying on DK, I would have more Kyrie, I would have more Giannis, I would have more Jokic than Lillard out of the studs for a number of reasons, but one being that McCollum makes a great pivot. The tough thing there is you want to have sort of these pivot peripheral pieces away from Lillard and Giannis if you're playing, say, Jokic and Irving, which is my first inclination, and you generally won't have room to play McCollum and Bledsoe and Middleton. But you can generally get away with Bledsoe or Middleton and McCollum and Irving and Jokic, and that's generally where I like to start. Still like Aminu. Still a little bit too cheap. Both sites. Real chance I think that the minutes tick up for him a little bit here. I'm surprised they haven't been a little bit higher. They need to move him around defensively a little better, do a little more switching as a team. Especially in the absence of Harkless, whomever fills in for him is going to be much worse defensively. He's got to do some more work, and I wouldn't be shocked if he ticks up to 35 minutes here, which we haven't seen yet this series, but I think is a real possibility. Of the bench pieces, my favorite after Hood is probably going to be probably Zach Collins still. Got some time at the 4 next to Canner last game, which is good to see. If you're playing him, it's another path to success out of him potentially. I think I've gone through just about everyone. Alright, so if you have any questions and you're watching the show on the YouTubes, go ahead and tweet me those questions. I'm going to start burning through The questions in the premium Slack chat. Suppose Harkless is out and Layman starts. He's pretty much a must-play. It takes so little to reach value, or no? No. And again, this speaks to the fact that people just don't understand what value is. Now, it's closer on a 2-game slate. On a 2-game slate, it is possible a guy costs $1,000 in Showdown and scores 8 and is good enough. On any sort of large slate, that's just impossible. It'll never work. There is an inherent cost to the spot in these lineups. Due to your lesser efficiency, you're reliant on more guys. It is rare that a guy is going to score, 8 fantasy points, and that's about what I have Jake. I think I have Jake Layman projected for 8.25 fantasy points if he starts. I think he's going to play like 15 goddamn minutes. No, I don't think he's a must play at all. Especially if that news comes out well in advance, Jake Layman will start. I would probably try to play none because there's just better $1,000 options that are going to be half his owned, and I have projected for more. Jake Layman is not terribly good. It's not a good matchup. Again, started the second half last game, and I want to say played 6 minutes and never returned in a close game. I'll check. Don't want to get it wrong, and I'm not certain here. Where are you at, Jake? Yeah. 5 minutes and 55 seconds. Never returned. With again Harkless unavailable, they ran out the string with Rodney Hood. Yeah. Is he out of play? No, of course not. He's a $1,000 guy who's going to start, and you could go there. But it depends when the news, comes out, especially. But Jake Layman, not a guy I'm particularly trying to target. And again, it's sort of like when it's the same thing as people saying this guy costs $3,000. All he needs to do is get me 18 and he got value. That's insane. That's wrong in cash. That's wrong. That's just simply not how that works. The number, again, there's 12 ways to prove it, but the easiest one is how many $3,000 players get, let's say, 21 or more a night. It's usually a lot. Like, it's not a rare thing. A number of value plays get there. How many $9,000 or more players get 7x a night? Few, if any. Sometimes it's 0. You have, low scoring days. So, playing popular cheap guys with a low ceiling, in the playoffs, I would want to have no Jake Layman for a few reasons. With Josh's projections, I was getting Giannis to about 88%. That's fine. You're taking a stand. Again, I prefer Jokic and spent 10 minutes discussing that, but I don't think that's crazy. Do you like Millsap or Tatum? I like Millsap from a raw points perspective by about 4 raw points, and Tatum's ownership is high enough. I would generally still stick with Millsap for $200 more. Millsap in almost all situations. One lineup on FanDuel, do you pay for Giannis or use both Miro and Hood instead? Yes. There's no correct answer to that. There's still a lot of lineup left to be built there. I have no problem playing Miro and Hood. I have no problem playing Hood and Barton. I have no problem playing Miro and Barton. I have no problem playing Hayward and any of those value guys, Giannis and Hayward. The best point per dollar, one of them is pretty significantly Hood. Is pretty significantly Miro. The Megastar Scrub approach is pretty much unplayable, right? And then this person has a lineup in front of me that is Kyrie, Giannis, Jokic, Lillard, and then Barton, Collins, Layman, and Turner. Yeah, you get rid of a guy there. I don't think this lineup is crazy, and I think you can do Jokic, Irving, and Giannis, or even get Lillard in there, but you power down one of those point guards and play some better value of, Miro, and get up to a Gary Harris at that point. So this lineup isn't unplayable, but Layman and Evan Turner for me is I think you're asking for a ton of trouble. I don't think you can put those two guys in the same thing. DKGPP, would you go Horford and Beasles or Millsap and Harris have Jokic and Irving already? I would be slightly more inclined towards Millsap and Harris, but pretty close. How are you projecting Kyrie versus Dame? We already did that. How are you playing the Kyrie versus Dame ownership? I imagine Kyrie is well higher owned. Throw out a guess here. Kyrie Irving, 49%. Damian Lillard, 38%. Yeah. I still, for, you were getting over on an extra 10% of the field. Again, when looking at ownership, the more relevant sort of thing to look at is the inverse, corollary, which is why when people are like, this guy's 50% more owned, he's 12% owned as opposed to 8, that doesn't matter that much, because the better way to look at it is, you are advancing over 92% of the field as opposed to 88% of the field. That's not that much better for you. It's not strictly that either, but looking at the inverse of them is better if you had to look at one single metric than looking at the direct representation. And that by extension of saying, yes, actually we've got an update there. We do have an update. Thank you for the heads up there. We have Kyrie at 52 and Lillard at 38. It's close. I mean, I prefer Kyrie to Lillard 55 to 45, and with the ownership, it's getting even closer to dead even. So I'm fine with it. I do think they're both around appropriately at their equanimity point. They're about where they should be. So I have no issue with you playing Lillard instead of Irving. I slightly prefer Irving even with the ownership thing, but no particularly strong take there. 8 minutes and change to go. Do you like Sterling Brown? We did that. 5.6k utility on DK. Jaylen Brown, Tatum, or Gary Harris. Generally, I would probably rather play Jaylen Brown out of those guys, though I would think with Gary Harris you have $700 you might be able to pick up somewhere else, but they're all definitely in the same ball of X. Thoughts on fitting Jokic and Giannis into one lineup on FanDuel? Your value players would be Rozier, Pat C, Monte Morris, and Mirotic. I'm fine with it. Mirotic probably gets there. You're probably not dropping him. So you need 2 out of the 3 of Rozier, Pat C, and Monte Morris to have tolerable games. That doesn't seem like a bridge too far, so I don't think I hate that much. Any chance Baines for a flyer in a tournament play? I mean, he's down to, I think it's 2,900 on DK. I still don't like it. We've obviously seen a lot of going small. We're going to see a lot of Giannis and Miro at center and all that going forward, so I don't think that his playing 10 or 12 minutes is a blip. I think that's what he ends up playing for a lot of this series. He's on the fringes of tournament playable for me. He can get you 17 in 12 minutes, where he makes 2 3-pointers, gets a couple blocks, etc. But, I mean, it's obviously on the fringes. Can you run Jokic and Giannis on FanDuel? Yes, pretty easily. There's enough good value. You run the other small forward and make it through with 5K guys. Why does Brolo suck versus Boston? Any chance he pulls off a big game tonight? No, we discussed it a bit before, and it's just that they run small a ton, and he can't defend their best offensive play, which is the Kyrie and Al Horford pick and roll. He just gets lost in it and can't defend that play, and they just maul him with it. And I can't think why they'd go away from it. It's been their most effective offensive set, and they're just much better with him off the floor. So it's minutes more than anything else, but yeah, it's just not a matchup that looks great for him. Boston has a couple good down low defenders. It's not a good spot for many people, but certainly him. Thoughts on this? Okay to play Harkless on FanDuel and take the risk? I have not updated my news since the beginning of the show, largely. I've gotten some alerts, obviously. But I would not play Harkless on FanDuel. Again, you need him to play the minutes, and do well. The price isn't that great. And again, this is a guy with a history of ankle problems. So I think especially because of that last bit, I am disinclined towards. Other than that, your plays on FanDuel looks fine, and you obviously can turn Harkless into Mirotic and will be just fine. Top 3 FanDuel value drop plays. Nikola Mirotic is pretty easy. Rodney Hood at the flat minimum is probably second. I gotta look. It's probably going to be Hood, though, Mirotic, and yeah, that third one is where it gets a little tricky. Alright, this isn't loading for me, so Hood, Mirotic, and somebody. I'm going to get back to asking questions, just being time efficient. McCollum, Hood, Aminu, Collins, okay in one lineup on FanDuel. Yes, because you're probably dropping Hood or Collins, so you're just basically saying, and they're both so cheap, so yes, that's fine. 7,100 utility DK, Horford, McCollum, Bledsoe, or Murray. I like all 4 of those plays. If I don't have Lillard, it's probably McCollum on top. Raw points, it's actually probably Horford by a little bit, but I have no issue with any of those, and it's going to have more to do with the rest of my lineup. Can you go stars and scrubs with good value tonight on DraftKings? Yes, I think so. Yahoo Cash, Hood, Millsap, or Brown, CJ Hood, Millsap, Brown, Mirotic, Middleton. It's going to be close. I can't figure it in my head. I got to look it up. I could figure it in my head, but I don't remember the numbers specifically enough. I have the second one by a fantasy point and a little bit of change. So Brown, Mirotic, Middleton, barely. DK, would you lock Mirotic? I would not. I would want some non-Mirotic lineups. I can imagine a world in which he doesn't get 4 steals and blocks, misses a few of his 3-pointers, ends up with 18 fantasy points, and the Malik Beasley and other lower-owned values of the world to get there. I think it's a very good play. I think I'd have less, actually slightly, than the field, which we projected around 70%, I think. I think I'd be closer to 50 or something. So no, I don't think I would lock him, but I don't have a problem if you do. It's unlikely he's going to disappoint 3,900. It's just a personal decision, really. Gary Harris or Aminu on DK? Yeah, that's interesting because that has to be utility. I'm going to take Aminu, though, keep in mind, like we've seen 30 minutes of Aminu and 40 minutes of Harris. If that doesn't change, I would end up with Harris projected a little higher, but I will go with Aminu. Would you stack Jokic and Giannis on FanDuel? No, I imagine I would play Jokic and value more frequently on FanDuel, but I would certainly have some lineups with that construction. There's no reason not to. Is Monty Morris a sneaky play on DK? I think he's fine. I do think his various defensive inequities, the continued good play of Beasley, the return of Craig, make it less likely he gets there. But Jamal Murray's a little bit banged up, and so I think it's fine to play, but I don't think it's brilliant, if that makes sense. Besides Irving and Horford, is the next best DK GPP play Morris? Are you only talking about Celtics for some reason? Hayward or Barton, small forward FanDuel GPP? Hayward if the money isn't doing anything for you. I slightly prefer Hayward raw pointsy, but Barton's fine as a punt. Is leaving $800 on the table too much tonight on DK? No, that's fine. It's close to the line, but on 2 game slate, it's fine. Plumlee or Collins, single entry, DK. I'd probably go with Collins. A little bit safer. Yeah, I'd probably go with Collins. If you have no Jokic, I would go with Plumlee. Rozier or Beasley, you have Irving on DK. I would go with Beasley then. Celtics only. No, I would still take Jaylen Brown after Irving and Horford. Then probably Morris, Hayward for me at those prices, but all pretty similar. All right, going into the news bubble for the 2 minutes we have remaining before lock. I really wish that alert had pinged for me. Have they decided not to give lineups yet, or did I just miss them? I'm sure the lineups are what we expect, but that's still a little bit frustrating. Alright, I'm into the updates bubble. I'm in the bubble. I'm the boy in the bubble. Minute and a half, everybody. Jeffrey Forever, I don't know if you're there, but if you asked me a question, I didn't see it again. Hopefully you either aren't there, because I could tell your frustration was growing. So you were not there. There's a single entry $1 contest on DK for you low entry people who's going to fill about 1,000 out of 1,500. It's going to overlay like 30%. It's $1, but 30% overlay is 30% overlay, and your buck's going to be worth $1.40. So yeah, if you got $1, try it in that. Any other interesting overlay about? For the full, yeah, for the 2 game slate. Good question. There is that. There is the showdown. That is very fair to point out as well. Hey, Jeffrey Forever, there he is. Okay. Hopefully, if you asked a question, I answered it. If I didn't, I don't know what to tell you. I assure you, I'm not intentionally issuing your questions. I do like any opportunity to use issue appropriately in a sentence, though. So you gave me that, which feels good. Tings, giant bee tings. I think we're there. We're there, friends. We have arrived at our destination. Alright, let's go back and look at the sites and see what do we got. Yeah, no, I get wanting to play DraftKings, and whenever you see Guy, who previously has had play Brook Lopez on DraftKings, whenever you see Guy who has a ceiling, we've previously seen him get there, and fail a couple of games in a row. It's, I think, a very healthy instinct to be, I want to get some exposure to that guy for when he finally has the game. But I do think that that his issues are transparent enough that the coaches know about him, and B, I do think his minutes continue to stay limited, and C, I do think the issue is endemic. I don't think it is, he's sad because his favorite teddy bear got put in the wash. I think it's, a shit matchup for him. If I don't have it in front of me, if you looked it up, I imagine, I believe he failed to get 20 fantasy points in 3 of the 4 games versus the Celtics in the regular season this year. It's a legitimately bad spot. And the great price on DK is not really that great because just, it's $900 more for Horford. That's just too cheap. I have Horford projected for 40 a game in this series. It's $5,600. That's too cheap, kids. So... let's do the ownership thing. What do we got? Alright, clicking over to FanDuel. Are we there? Do we have a thing? 400. Yeah, also there were $900,000. I buried the lead here a little bit in big prizes in tonight's tournament. So let's look at some prices, or some ownerships rather. Nikola Mirotic, FanDuel, 61%. Kyrie Irving, 63%. Eric Bledsoe, 24%. I objectively like that. He can do steals and blocks and FanDuel, and it's obviously all relative to other guys, but 24 Bledsoe, 38 Middleton. I like both those numbers. Tatum, 30. I like that number. Feels like a good number. It's a happy number. Giannis, 64. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna come in under. There are spend ups and middle spends on the McCollums and Bledsoes and Middletons of the world. I just like a little more than 11 plus on Giannis at the road in Boston. Obviously, he can certainly turn out, but I think I'd be in the 40% range. 65 is that's a commitment. Internet, you're making a commitment. Where's Horford? That's the curious one. So Tatum 30, Morris 35. Interesting. Not the ownership we expected. 35% Horford. Okay, so you're going to have 35% Horford. Yeah, so that means you have Giannis at 64%. You're going to have You're going to have Jokic at... Someone check me on this one, by the way. Someone send me a tweet at 10:30. What is Nikola Jokic's ownership on FanDuel? I will say it is 48.5%. So 15% less than Giannis. So I'm even getting the ownership. Yeah, I'm just going to spend the money on Jokic there a little more frequently than not. I think, I would say we'll see later, but we won't see later. This is another important point that one game samples are ridiculously small. Whether you're talking about, the Raptors beating the 76ers or, Embiid getting 30 or 60 fantasy points. There's just such a giant range of outcomes that in one game tonight, I'm not surprised if, Giannis gets 100 and Jokic gets a subdural hematoma, or his family gets blown up in a bus by a Croatian nationalist because they drive over an IED on their way to the arena. Like, it's just so many things can possibly happen. So very frustrating for me. Like, if at the end of 6 months you're like, hey, I've been listening to your advice for 6 months, you're balls, I lost everything, you're wrong all the time. I gotta kind of look at that. But there will be people who will come at me tonight and be like, dude, I can't believe you thought Jokic was going to outscore Giannis, because it's the north of 40% of the time, in my opinion, that Giannis outscores Jokic. Might be north of 45%. That's just, ownership, positionality, and a couple other things. So let's look at DK, where they had a $500,000 today, right? I saw that, didn't I? Where are you, DK? That's a $500 quarter jukebox, not a $500,000. $500,000 playoff spectacular. Spectacular. No words in my vernacular can help me describe how exciting that is. $100,000 for first, which doesn't feel as ridiculous as when there's only $300,000 in prizes. Loading up the database. Taking a look. Don't you want a taste of the good life? See what it tastes like. Alright. Here we go. Numero uno. Again, right about where we projected. Have this one pretty well on. Nikola Mirotic. 64%. Yeah, that's fine. I have no... You told me you had 50, I'd be like, cool. You told me you had 100, I'd be like, cool. It's probably going to get there. There's obviously any number of ranges of outcomes, and Miro at 22 is different than Miro at 26, is different than Miro at 34, but... Kyrie Irving, 60. That's a number. That's probably now tilting it over to I'd rather play Lillard. Like, we had 48, 49. I still liked, Kyrie versus, at the time, 38 Lillard or something. Then we had, 52, 53. Actual number coming in close to 60. If there's 60% Irving and 31% Lillard, then obviously at that point I'm going to prefer Damian Lillard. Giannis, 51. Cool. Chris Middleton, 48. Yes, I'm going to prefer Bledsoe at that number. So Giannis, 51. Nifty. Middleton, 48. Nifty. Eric Bledsoe is 25, by the way. So yes, I will take half the ownership on Bledsoe versus Giannis and Middleton. I do think he is the least likely of the three to go nutty. But add half the ownership. That makes more sense. Marcus Morris, 47%. Yeah, I would have less than that. Chalk last game. Got there as chalk. Everyone's got a nice warm chubbly for him at this point. That certainly makes sense, but again, will not often shoot 75% from the field. The minutes are solid. He's $4,600. No issue with you playing any amount of Marcus Morris, but again, there's a lot of dudes we really like on this slate who cost, $3,300 to $4,900. So, Mirotic 64%. Marcus Morris 47%. I'll play a couple of those other guys who I project slightly worse, but at those ownerships. Al Horford, 36%. It makes me question my work, my influence, my value as a human being. Okay. Jason Tatum, 26%, which is just insanity. I have, Jason Tatum costs $200 less than Al Horford. I have Al Horford projected for 11 and a quarter more fantasy points. 11 and a fucking quarter. So I'm going to put down the weak vape. Go to the strong vape. I basically guaranteed Tatum outscores Horford now, right? That's what I'm doing. Okay. Jaylen Brown, 26%. Basically the exact same as Jason Tatum. So again, ownership miss for us on Jason Tatum, who we had around 40. 26 is less than 40. Hashtag analysis. Eric Bledsoe, 25. Again, yes, I'd rather go there. Pat Connaughton, 16. Getting time. Terry Rozier, 14.5. I'd rather play Connaughton at that point. Gordon Hayward, 13. Yeah, so Gordon Hayward, humorously enough, Eric Bledsoe is almost exactly half of Giannis and Middleton. Gordon Hayward is almost exactly half of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, both within 1%. Yeah, I'll take the half-owned guys in that situation. And Hayward hasn't gotten there yet. So yeah, I would have liked Hayward at 13%. George Hill, 7.6. Brook Lopez, 6%. Okay, they're doing it, 6%. Ersan, 5%, $3,100. I'm fine there. Sterling Brown was sub 1%. You got it right, 0.9%. Aaron Baines, 0.4%. Is that Marcus Smart? It says Marcus, and we've already passed Morris. Yeah, Marcus Smart, 0.23%. That's like 30 lineups. That is an odd degree of affection for Marcus Smart. And also, congratulations, you played yourself. So there we are. I imagine I will be off tomorrow. I will reconnoiter with my bettors and confirm that. But I will certainly be back Sunday for the 2 games. And Monday and Tuesday, I think, are all locked 2 games. Then we start getting into the if necessaries of the world. But I'll be on for the next 6 or 7 days. Maybe do another charity show in the meantime. Sell some advice or something. Made a few $100s for some good causes the day before yesterday. So that was an enjoyable experience. So if you have any further questions, please send them to me. If I missed yours, I apologize. I'm sitting here micro machine talking through everything I can in the hour, but again, there's usually 100 questions and I get to 60 or 70 of them, so apologies for those I did not touch upon. There it is, friends. I'll be around, especially for the Osmo.com members, for the late slates in 2.5 hours. So enjoy the games. Best of luck, and bon chance.